This broadcast of the Hamptons Institute at Guildhall is being brought to you by Bridgehampton National Bank.
We're thrilled that so many of you took some time from the most beautiful day of the summer to be with us and to hear our extraordinary speakers. We really appreciate your support and participation. I had the good fortune about a year and a half ago to be called by Mickey Strauss, the visionary chairman of the board of the Guildhall, and to meet with him and Ruth Appelhoff, his executive director, who's doing such an extraordinary job, and with Jeff Tarr, who has been an amazing, generous supporter of this program. They said to me that this is a community with historic roots back to the early part of the colonial era, but certainly the early part of the 19th century, when talking to each other, people coming together in a kind of town hall format, was what built the community and made it an effective democratic polity, a place where democracy flourished. They asked me if I could help them make this lovely room into a bit of a town hall. This is an institution which has been so distinguished in its cultural offerings, but they wanted ideas, kind of modeled on the Aspen Institute. I suggested a partnership with a wonderful, enterprising new institution in New York, the Roosevelt Institute. Actually, it's not so new. It's been around a very long time as the partner to the Roosevelt Library and Presidential Museum in Hyde Park. And the logic of the partnership seemed obvious to me because there's never been really a more effective communicator as president than Franklin Roosevelt, who believed very much that one could heal the body politic, could bring people together if we just brought them out into conversation with each other. So that's the point of the Hamptons Institute, and it's been working quite well, actually. We are thrilled with the number of incredibly distinguished people who have been willing to give of their time voluntarily and come and talk to us. Some of them from our own community. Part of what motivated this very smart idea was that we have so many extraordinary journalists and political actors and policymakers as part of our own community. You're going to meet a few of them today. Lyn Sheer, our moderator, and Bob Caro, our Pulitzer Prize-winning historian and biographer and neighbor. But also we felt that being here by the sea, we could draw people from all over the country, and we've done that. We had a wonderful panel this morning on the Middle East. We had an extraordinary one yesterday on the economic challenges that face our country. And before that, we had a little bit fun before we got too serious with 4 of our own local producers talking about how to make it on Broadway. And if you weren't able to get to any of these, I encourage you to watch them on the Guildhall website. They're all on YouTube or on our partner station, the public television station here in the Hamptons, which is videotaping all of this. And this session, I should tell you, is also going to be on C-SPAN. So we encourage you to participate in the session by asking robust and interesting questions, as everybody's been doing all along this year and last, but also to stand up when you ask your questions so the C-SPAN audience can hear you. I want to thank the extraordinary staff of Guildhall and supporters of Guildhall for their incredible efficiency in putting together this program and attending to every detail. I want to thank Jeff Tarr and his family for their continued and generous support, the Chubb Insurance Agency and their cornerstone partner in East Hampton, Dayton, Ritz Osborne, who've been lead supporters and sponsors of the Institute. I certainly want to thank again my partner in crime, Mickey Strauss, and Ruth. And also my wonderful colleagues at the Roosevelt Institute, this enterprising young think tank now in New York, which is creating a living legacy to Franklin Roosevelt. Not only are we helping preserve his legacy in monuments and in museums and libraries, but creating a vibrant think tank looking at economic and human rights issues that are the foundation of the legacy of the Roosevelts, and participating in this kind of communication, which is so much of his legacy. So thank you all for coming. I'm going to introduce Lyn Sheer, my dear friend, longtime friend, and East Hampton resident, whom I met on the floor of the Democratic Convention lest I say this so long ago, in 1984, when she was an enterprising political reporter working with Peter Jennings at ABC. She had an extraordinarily distinguished career, as you all know, at ABC, doing not only political reporting, but a tremendous amount of human interest reporting on 2020. She's an author of many books, and she's going to introduce our wonderful panel. Welcome Lyn Sheer to the stage. Are you there, Lyn? And thank you all again for coming.
Thank you, Ellen. Welcome to all of you. Get everybody seated here. So nice to have you all with us this afternoon. And I want to start off by telling you, in one of those great moments, I actually, driving over here this afternoon, found myself behind a car with an Obama 08 bumper sticker on it. My initial reaction was, thank goodness there's somebody who keeps a car as long as I do. And then I looked closely and I realized that the bumper sticker was a little worn, a little abused by the elements, but in fact, of course, it was still quite legible and it was still very red, white, and blue. And not to be too silly or glib about this, but I did wonder if that was some kind of metaphor for what this president is now going through. How successful is he? How bruised, in fact, is he? How, to paraphrase Ed Koch, is he doing? I want to start out by saying that also, if I were President Obama, I am not so sure I would want to be here this afternoon to hear the answer. With all due respect, the idea of being discussed and dissected by the biographers of Lyndon Baines Johnson and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and by a New Yorker writer who has said, and I quote, he, Mr. Obama, is not that messianic figure that many of his supporters think he is. I think that would be daunting to everyone. I do not mean to suggest that any of these gentlemen is prepared to draw or quarter the president. In fact, some of them have written and said very fine things about him and his campaign. Some of them may or may not have voted for him. Two of them, Bob Caro and H.W. Brands, actually had dinner with the president at the White House earlier this week, and that is all I could find out from either of them about what went on there. And that will be the end of that conversation. Some of these gentlemen have also indicated, however, differences between our 44th president and the men, and yes, of course, they are all men, who preceded them, some felicitously, some not so. Each one of the panelists has very deep insights into what a president should do, what makes a president, what makes him succeed and endure, and in fact, what can bring him down. So just over 2.5 years into the Obama presidency, what better time to discuss this? And 16 months, yes, we have 16 months to endure all of the nonsense. 16 months before the next election, what more critical subject? So let's begin with an introduction, and the introduction, oh, by the way, just to make the rules clear, we're going to play among ourselves up here and let you listen in and talk about some very interesting points, I hope. And then I'll be opening it up to questions from you. So please get your questions ready, because we do want to hear from you in just a bit. So I'm going to introduce everybody just in the order in which we're seated. George Packer. George became a staff writer for The New Yorker in 2003 and has covered the Iraq War for the magazine. His book, The Assassin's Gate, America in Iraq, was named one of the 10 best books of 2005 by the New York Times, and that among many other awards that he won for that book. George Packer has also written about some of the most inhospitable countries in West Africa. In 2003, he got 2 Overseas Press Club awards, one about the occupation and reconstruction of Iraq, the other about the Civil War in Sierra Leone. He is the author of The Village in Waiting, about his experience in Africa. He is also the author of the book Blood of the Liberals, a 3-generational nonfiction history of his family and American liberalism in the 20th century, which won the Robert F. Kennedy Book Award. He's written 2 novels and a newer book, Interesting Times, Writing from a Turbulent Decade. He served in the Peace Corps in Togo in West Africa, and is currently working on a book about, and this is a quote from him, institutional decline in America, a small subject. Welcome to George Packer.
Thank you, Lyn. Thank you all. I'm glad to have beaten the traffic in Bridgehampton and
Yes,
arrived 2 minutes before the event was to begin.
George drove out from Brooklyn, and nobody gave him the back road map. So here he is. Bob Caro, who many of you know because he is one of us and lives right out here, as you well know, has written extraordinary, truly adjective-busting biographies. For his biographies of Robert Moses and Lyndon Johnson, he twice won the Pulitzer Prize for biography, twice won the National Book Critics Circle Award for Best Nonfiction Book of the Year, and has gotten virtually every other major literary honor, including the National Book Award, the Gold Medal in Biography from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and on and on and on and on. And I would love to read them all, but I'd rather get to our subject in a minute. His first book was, of course, The Power Broker, Robert Moses and the Fall of New York. The Modern Library called it one of the 100 greatest nonfiction books of the 20th century. I would say, echoing the words of many, many before me and still to come, that it is the single best book about a city, and certainly our city, New York City, that you will ever read. To research the years of Lyndon Johnson, his ongoing biography, Bob and his wife Ina moved from New York to the Texas Hill Country and then to Washington, D.C. to literally live the life that Lyndon Johnson lived as he was growing up and getting started. His first book in the series, The Path to Power, was called by the Washington Post proof that we live in a great age of biography. They called it a book of radiant excellence. The second volume was called by Professor Henry Graff of Columbia brilliant. No review does justice to the drama of the story Caro is telling, which is nothing less than how present-day politics was born. And the third volume was hailed by the London Times as a masterpiece. Robert Caro has written one of the truly great political biographies of the modern age. We are all eagerly awaiting Volume 4. Welcome to Bob Caro.
You were doing great until the last line.
Yeah, I know. Bob hates it when you ask when the next volume is coming out. But H.W. Brands, who assures me that we may call him Bill, was born. This is his first trip to the East End of Long Island, so a special welcome to him for that. Bill was born in Oregon. He went to college in California. He sold in the family business. He sold cutlery across the American West for a while. And he earned graduate degrees in math and history in Oregon and Texas. He has taught at Vanderbilt, at Texas A&M, and now he is at the University of Texas at Austin, where he is the Dixon Allen Anderson Centennial Professor of History. Bill writes on American history and politics, and his books include Traitor to His Class, Andrew Jackson, The Age of Gold, The First American, and TR. Several of his books have been bestsellers. 2 were finalists for the Pulitzer Prize. He lectures frequently on history and on current events. You can see him on TV, you can hear him on the radio, and he is now working on a book about yet another president, Ulysses S. Grant. Please welcome H.W. Brands.
Thanks, Lyn.
Okay, gentlemen, welcome to all of you. Let's start with, just briefly, an assessment from each one of you on how this president is doing. Is he the eat your peas president? Or is he the I got Osama bin Laden president? Or is it something else? And Bob, I'm going to let you start it off.
Thanks. Well, the only thing I can say to you is how we think he's doing is going to look a lot different in some years than it does now. It always does. If there's anything I've learned from my books, it's that things look so different at the time than they do a few years down the road. In fact, I can give you an example from Robert Moses, and not Lyndon Johnson. Robert Moses was so popular in New York City. I went to Horace Mann, and what we had to write for everybody in our class had to write for their junior paper. Robert Moses is the perfect example of the great knight in literature, right? Then
the great knight?
Yeah, in literature.
K-N-I-G-H-T.
K-N-I-G. Then that was, say, the 1950s, and by the 1970s, he was the great villain of New York. So everything changes.
Right. So you're saying, you're not going to answer my question.
Sure, I will say that I think things that look so important and vital in the Obama presidency right now are going to look different. For example, I mean, we already, the events of the moment are what captures everybody's attention. So it's seldom mentioned right now that when he took office, people were walking around worrying about whether they had more than $100,000 in the bank because the bank might fail, or that he came to office with a war in Iraq, or that that was really a problem, and that he came, most important, he came to office, and no one really mentions this, at the very crest of a tide of conservatism that you could say began near the end of the Lyndon Johnson presidency, about over 40 years ago, and has just come to a crest and is crashing in this irrationality of the Tea Party movement. And these are all things he's had to face, that he stepped into. So I think that however we feel about it now, history will look at these more in the context of those things and a lot of other things.
Okay. Bill, let's go to you for another history point of view, or not history, up to you.
I think President Obama is doing about as well as any president could under the circumstances. He became president and was handed an extremely difficult hand to deal with. It was difficult precisely because it wasn't absolutely terrible. You probably remember the cover of it was either Time or Newsweek, right after Obama was elected, where he was in that Franklin Roosevelt pose. And they had photoshopped something so he had a cap on his head and he had a cigarette holder. And the caption on the cover was, Franklin Delano Obama. And there was some thought that Obama was going to usher in a New Deal. Well, in fact, a lot of Obama's supporters hoped that was exactly what was going to happen. But it wasn't going to happen because things were bad, but not bad enough. If you recall, when Obama was elected, the unemployment rate was 6%. And Wall Street was teetering, and nobody knew whether it was going to go over the edge or not. Now, what this meant was that he had a huge challenge. He had to deal with bad economic times. But unlike Franklin Roosevelt, they weren't so bad that he was free to do whatever he wanted. Franklin Roosevelt was elected after the country had been in a full-blown depression for 2.5 years. And in part because of this, Americans generally gave him carte blanche to do whatever he wanted to do. He could do no wrong because things were so bad they couldn't get worse. Obama had in mind that there were some major changes to the American financial system, to the American system of governance, but he couldn't undertake the steps to get there because everything that he did had to be weighed. Would it spook Wall Street? Would it make this financial crisis a full-blown depression? Now, in fact, the full-blown depression did not occur. And one can argue that, well, with these sort of things, you never know whether it would have or it wouldn't have, but it did not occur, and he ought to get some credit for the fact that it did not occur. But he's not going to get credit, because in American politics, you don't get credit for things that didn't happen. You get credit or responsibility for things that did happen. And so, he has managed the American economy about as well as I think it could have been managed, given the opposition in Congress and the fact that he's got Republicans in control of the House of Representatives. So I would say that he has done about as well as could be done under the circumstances, but I know there were plenty of people who voted for him who were thinking this is going to be a transformational president. It's not going to happen, and it's not going to happen because the context is not right. Things are bad, but not bad enough.
It's the first time I've heard someone say, gee, if they were worse off, maybe he'd be doing better, but okay, we'll get back to that. George Packer, how's he doing?
Yeah, I think he's been very surprising. He is so different from the candidate that I think it's taken a long time for the public to sort of catch up with the real president that he is, as opposed to the figure who seized the world's imagination in 2008 when he just streaked to the nomination, and then his meteor continued to rise to the election. He is not a Roosevelt. He's not a figure who would fit sort of a Depression era, New Deal era time. He reminds me of an earlier time, maybe a progressive era figure in his high-mindedness, his cerebral qualities. He's so reasonable. His speech is so lofty and moralizing. He's very comfortable moralizing. He reminds me a little of Wilson in that sense. He's a bit remote and aloof like Wilson, and I think he would probably have done better if he'd been governing at a time closer to the progressive era when there were, it was not one crisis after another. There was no Fox News, there was no Michelle Bachmann. It was, although there were rational tendencies, as there have always been in American politics, it was a time when an appeal to sort of civic mindedness and political reform and those higher qualities actually had a real audience, especially among sort of the professional middle classes across the country who were the real backbone of the progressive movement. Instead, Obama is a reasonable man speaking into a hurricane all the time. And that is why, if his presidency has fallen short, I think why it has. His policy.
You're presenting a picture of a man who is at odds with the times around him.
I think so. He may be behind and ahead at the same time. I think he's always 3 steps ahead of the rest of the sort of more ordinary politicians and perhaps of the public. I mean, you mentioned I'm writing a book about decline. I think Obama may well see his job as to manage as well as he can a period of American decline. I don't think that this is a president who really believes that we will bestride the world like a colossus again, and I don't think he wants us to.
He said yesterday in that, was that the second or third press conference in a row on the debt ceiling, he said, and I can't do it verbatim, some version of, this is a time we have a chance to do something big. We can make a big change. Not bestriding the world, but what you're talking about.
Meaning cutting $4 trillion from the debt. Yeah. I mean, of course he says that. All American presidents have to talk that way. But there's a kind of a gap between what we expect of the president and what I think Obama is really thinking, which I can't be sure about, but there's a lot of indicators based on action. The thing he's failed at is a strange thing. It's connecting to the public. This is what he did so well in 2008. But since then, he's had a terribly difficult time moving people, persuading people, being heard above the noise of the hurricane that's out there, which is a political hurricane, an economic hurricane, a cultural hurricane, a news hurricane. There's just so much noise, and Obama is so thoughtful and so unwilling to descend to the sound bites and the cheap phrases that a president actually needs in order to reach the public in a deep way. I think he has failed to lead in that sense, and that is the disappointment in his presidency.
This is all the people who are saying, I wish he would just do something. I wish he would be the man that I voted for.
Ask yourself, how many phrases can you remember from his presidency? I mean, I can remember, I could quote, based on the great books of these two gentlemen, 2 dozen phrases from the first couple of years of Johnson's presidency and of Roosevelt. There was something called the New Deal. There was something called the Great Society. What phrases stick from Obama? There are none.
Audacity of hope.
Well, that was before he became president.
I understand, and I'm agreeing with you.
And my point is that since he's become president, he has been so consumed with the tremendous problems he inherited, and in coming up with, in his way, reasonable policy solutions. It's almost as if he can't do that and reach out to the broad public with those memorable phrases that I think are part of the job of a
Which you
president.
have to have. Bob Caro, let me go back to you now and talk a little bit about the LBJ comparison, which is in so many ways a terrible comparison, but maybe there are ways that aren't. Start with the difference between the way President Johnson got things done and the way this president is or isn't getting things done.
How did Lyndon Johnson get things done? I'll answer you with a quote from a senator named Scoop Jackson from the state of Washington, who served in both the House of Representatives and the Senate with Johnson. He said, President Kennedy was a wonderful communicator, he said, but when he needed a vote from a senator, he'd have the senator down to the White House, and he'd give them all the reasoned arguments why he had to have this vote. But if the senator said, if I give you this vote, it'll kill me with my constituency, Kennedy would always say, I understand. He said, Lyndon Johnson wouldn't understand. He said he would charm you or threaten you or cajole you or bribe you. He would do whatever he had to, but he would get your vote. And you see this with Johnson over and over again. You see him getting votes in the Senate that you don't believe are possible to pass his legislation.
And is this the model? Is that what Americans want for a president? Do they want a Lyndon Johnson who cajoles and does, pick your verb of choice, many worse things than that? Or do they want a more reasoned diplomat, which is what our current president appears to be?
Well, it depends what Lyndon Johnson you're talking about. Are you talking about the Lyndon Johnson of 1964 and 1965, where he passed Medicare, Medicaid, two great civil rights bills, which seemed impossible to pass, we don't even remember that, and 70 separate education bills? Or are you talking about the Lyndon Johnson of 66, 67, and 68? Where he's this figure who deceived the American public, who tried to get us into a war, who got us into a war in Asia, tried to do it basically as James Reston wrote. He said, the president of the, this was after Johnson's first escalation of 125,000 troops, which he did on a Saturday because he thought it wouldn't get much coverage on Sunday. And James Reston said, the president of the United States got us into a land war in Asia last night in secret. So it's you know, there's something to be said for a president who establishes a persona. I think the persona that Obama has established is thoughtful, smart, honest, calm, and is trying to negotiate his way through, which I think George's word, a hurricane, as best he can. I think there's a lot to be said for that.
Bill, you've written about another wartime president. To what extent are these wars, is there any parallel with World War II, with FDR, or are these wars so utterly different that again, back to the hurricane word, that he can't make his way through it?
The wars that the United States is fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan and maybe a little bit in Libya are so different from World War II that there's really no meaningful comparison. Because with this group, if we weren't told that there was a war going on in Afghanistan, you'd hardly know it. Very few people that I know have relatives who are fighting in Iraq or Afghanistan. It's a war that's fought by an all-volunteer, which means professional army. And so I have been on college campuses teaching since the 1980s. And there are no protests against the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. There is public opinion poll after public opinion poll shows that Americans think the United States needs to get out of Afghanistan. But it gains no traction because that opposition, there's nothing to mobilize the opposition. Now, with Franklin Roosevelt, one of the reasons, a principal reason that he was able to get so much done during the first 100 days, which, by the way, he had no idea that there was going to be 100 days. He called Congress into emergency session to deal with the fact that the banking system was collapsing. So he was going to send Congress an emergency banking bill and send them home. But they were so willing to go along with what he sent that he said, okay, let's try something else. And one thing led to another and led to another. And by the time he ran out of things to send to Congress, 100 days had passed, and so that became the yardstick for all future presidents to be measured by. But Roosevelt had huge majorities in both houses of Congress, and so he could get whatever he wanted. Barack Obama, in essence, had to deal with a divided Congress from his inauguration. Now, it's true that the Democrats had majorities in both houses, but due to changes in the definition of a filibuster that still somewhat confuse me, nowadays, to get anything through the Senate, you have to have 60 votes. And he didn't have that, and so he had to deal with an opposition that decided to go into opposition against his presidency. And Mitch McConnell said right at the beginning that the first order of business was to make sure that Barack Obama was going to be a one-term president. Well, Roosevelt didn't have to deal with that. And so Obama's situation was entirely different. Now, there's something else. I think Obama was the victim of his own brilliance as a campaigner. I've been observing American politics since the 1960s. The first campaign I vaguely remember was the 1960 campaign. And I studied a lot of them, and I've never seen a politician, other than a victorious general, they play by different rules, but an ordinary politician who came out of nowhere. Before the summer of 2004, almost nobody had heard of Barack Obama. And 4 years later, he is he's elected President of the United States. And he was this individual who allowed people to project onto him their hopes for what America could be in a difficult time. And his campaign slogan, "Yes, we can," was absolutely brilliant. Yes, we can what? Whatever you want. Well, that's fine for a candidate. But once you get elected, the operative phrase is no longer "yes, we can," it's "no, you can't." Because you have to choose. When you're a candidate, you don't have to choose. You let everybody believe what they want to believe. Now, it's also worth remembering, and you'll have your own opinions on this, but absent the financial crisis of 2008, John McCain would be President of the United States. Because as long as the most salient issue was the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, Obama's background, Obama's biography, didn't measure up to McCain's. But then, more or less out of the blue, the ground changed. And Wall Street shuddered, and McCain's biography now, as the military veteran, the war hero, prisoner of war, and all this, it no longer meant anything. And so people were willing to give Obama a close second look, and they decided, okay, it's time for a change, we'll give him a try. Well, okay, so now he's president, and all sorts of people think that he's going to bring in this grand new revolution, this reform, and all this other stuff. Well, it wasn't going to happen because the crisis wasn't quite deep enough. He had to tread very gingerly. I happen to think, I'm guessing this, but I happen to think that Obama is probably waiting to get this debt ceiling issue resolved one way or the other so he can move back into campaign mode. He's a brilliant campaigner, and I think he will be able to connect with Americans the way he did in the campaign of 2008, because one of the things...
But based on what? What does he use as his campaign slogan this year?
Well, first, I would say the only adult in Washington, the only one who's dealing with these is reasonable. But the thing is, polls show, there was a recent poll that showed that 80% of Americans think that to deal with the debt ceiling and the deficit, there ought to be some combination of spending cuts and tax increases. But the trouble is that that particular public is not the one that Republicans in the House of Representatives are responding to. They're looking over their right shoulders at a much smaller public, the one that will throw them out in the primaries next season if they vote for anything in the way of a tax increase. But once this issue is off the table, and it will be off the table in one way or another, then he can reach out to the broader American public. I think he does very well with the broad public. But as long as the public is split up between the Democrats on one side, Republicans on the other, then he can't reach those Republican zealots. But I think he can reach the broader public.
So you're saying once we get by August 2nd, he comes out of his... pops out of the egg as a whole different person, or he goes back to who he was?
I think he goes back to who he was in the summer of 2008, when he can campaign instead of having to govern.
Oh, and he's a better campaigner.
Because governing's always harder than campaigning. He's a better campaigner than governor.
George, I saw you champing at the bit here.
Well, it's going to be hard for him to do that because, I mean, during the 2.5 years of his presidency, forget about the official unemployment rate. The real unemployment rate, basically 1 in 6 Americans is out of work right now, which is a staggering number. It isn't quite 1930s levels, but it's the closest we've been since the 30s. I think what Obama is, that will be what he has to account for throughout the campaign. And I honestly don't know what the theme of his campaign is going to be. This is part of the deficiency I see in his leadership. He has not articulated a vision that Americans can quickly understand and either subscribe to or not. The only adult in Washington is basically who he is. I'm not sure that's a wildly successful campaign theme. One thing that Obama lacks that LBJ and FDR both had is a movement. FDR had eventually labor behind him. He also had all the discontents of the 30s that in some ways opposed him, but eventually, once Huey Long was out of the picture, et cetera, became this overwhelming majority that brought him to re-election in 36. LBJ had the civil rights movement pushing from below for what LBJ behind the scenes was cajoling, twisting arms, flattering, et cetera, to get done in Congress. There is no movement behind Obama. The only movement we've had since the biggest financial crisis since the Depression is the Tea Party movement, which is implacably hostile to him. They have filled a vacuum. Obama couldn't create a movement, but I think once he became president, that 10 million named, the list of 10 million names that was his email list, which was sort of the movement that brought him to the presidency, just disappeared. It went home. They were no longer being asked to do anything. And without a movement in a critical time like this, it's very hard for the president to summon the troops in the thick of a campaign in which he is going to be on the hot spot because the Republicans are going to say 1 in 6 Americans is out of work.
So what do you say to this, the driver of this car that I saw, and innumerable people I've spoken to who were Obama supporters, who are still Obama supporters, who are nonetheless disappointed? They say, he's not speaking. I voted for him, I will vote for him again, but I'm not getting what I want from him.
That's politics. I mean, get over it. You wanted a miracle worker. Yes, we can was the slogan of a miracle worker. You didn't get it. You got a human being who has amazing qualities. You tick them off very, very well, Bob.
Well, but what's left out is what is governing. You talk about that they had movements, but turning a movement into laws. I mean, what is governing in a democracy? Governing in a democracy is passing laws. Lyndon Johnson called it writing it into the books of law. He said, we've talked about civil rights for 100 years. Now it's time to write it into the books of law. They had a civil rights movement, but the Southerners controlled Congress. No civil rights bill, I'll go back to the one he actually passed his majority, had passed at Senate in 87 years, since Reconstruction. Mm-hmm. Johnson has to get this bill through. It doesn't matter that there's civil rights movement in the streets. The Southerners are not going to let it through. To watch him do that is to see genius in the art of governing. The Southerners, he works out this deal where the Southerners said they'll let a weak bill pass, and Johnson says that's enough. The important thing is to get something passed to show we can pass something. If we get a bill passed, it can be a bad bill, but we can always go back and pass it later. I've got to get it passed. He gets the Southerners to agree that they'll allow a weak bill to pass as long as they can be assured that if the liberals try to amend it into a stronger bill, they will have a block of votes on their side to sustain the filibuster and let them stop it. Johnson knows he needs a block of votes. He's not within 1 or 2 votes. He's 10 or 12 votes short. You can see him in the memos in the Johnson Library trying to figure out, where can I get 10 or 12 votes? Mm-hmm. And he figures it out. There's a dam on the river, the Snake River, between Idaho and Oregon. It's called the Hells Canyon Dam, and the Westerners, the Rocky Mountain States Westerners, and there are 12 Democrats there, 12 Democratic votes. They've been trying to get this dam for 20 years, and the South has always blocked it. He goes to the Westerners and says, I'll give you the dam if you agree to vote with the South, and they agree. So that he has, in this one stroke, linked a dam in the Northwest to the civil rights movement and got it within 3 or 4 votes of passing. And then Lyndon Johnson comes into play. He's still 3. Now he's got to get them one by one. And to watch him know what these senators want and give them what they want or withhold what they want is to see this brutal force. But the end result of it is governance. He has gotten the bill passed.
Okay, and let me just add here. Bob told me the other day that when Bob, won the National Humanities Medal in 2010, President Obama said to him, and I quote, "I think about Robert Caro and reading The Power Broker back when I was 22 years old and just being mesmerized, and it helped to shape how I think about politics." So the question is, what has President Obama learned about politics?
Well, sorry you asked me that. But I think that so far, I think that the things that George and Bill said, the difficulties of doing this are really very real. But, you know, part of the problem is Senator Obama was only a senator for 3 years. And for part of that 3 years, a large part of the 3 years, he was out campaigning.
Right.
It's very hard to learn Congress, to learn the Senate. It's really another world. So when you come in, I like to think that he's been on a learning curve. You know, he strikes me as an extremely...
Yeah, but on-the-job learning is not what we want for our presidents, is it?
You know, can I add something about just throwing in your story, your great story about how LBJ got the 57 Civil Rights Bill passed. So the equivalent would be the health care bill. Obama really needed every last vote. And I studied that pretty carefully. I was in the Senate a lot during the last votes. And, you know, he did it. He got it done against great odds. I remember what it was like when Scott Brown was elected in Massachusetts. Many Democrats said, forget it, we're never going to get this thing done. And Obama basically was the one who said, we are, along with Nancy Pelosi. But after the midterms, I went down to Virginia the next day, to this southwestern Virginia, which is coal mining country. The 30-year congressman there, Rick Boucher, tremendously popular. He had just been defeated by someone who didn't even live in the district. It was like anyone but the Democrat. And I asked a bunch of people, you know, why would you throw out this popular congressman who brought home a ton of bacon to a poor area? They said, you know, Obama disappointed us. We thought he was a new kind of politician. Instead, we saw him wheeling and dealing and trading, you know, Medicaid payments and the Louisiana Compromise and dealing with the insurance companies and the hospitals and giving everything away in order to get this health care bill. He wasn't supposed to be that type. In other words, Obama's living in an age where 2 hours after the deal that LBJ would cut with whoever was done, the whole world knew, and it's stomach turning. And so Obama had to sort of, he mastered legislation in that case, and it killed him.
He didn't have to do that, because what Lyndon Johnson would have said is, I think I said, the important thing is, you know, he actually, being Lyndon Johnson, he was always trying to say the important thing was to get a bill passed. He said, we can always go back and fix it. He said, once they lose the virginity, it'll be easier next time. That's the guy I'm writing about, actually. He's got a lot of phrases like that. But he would say, we got it passed. And my feeling, actually, is that Obama could say the same thing. We have a health care bill. It will be easier to fix it than to pass a bill. And let's say I think it's a bad bill. I do think it's a bad bill. But it'll be easier to fix it than to start all over again and pass another one. And he did it.
Is it all about politics? Is it all about whether he can govern and not living up to campaign promises? Or how much of what we're seeing now has to do with personality? Bill, is there historically a president who has withstood so much comment about, is he too aloof, is he not aloof, is he not down and dirty enough, is he too down and dirty, is he not part of the group? The personality thing is astounding.
Yeah, and start with George Washington. I mean, the reason I say this is that there is this notion that somehow a semi-monolithic media has broken apart into all these different fractions, and that people now can watch Fox News if they don't want to hear what CNN has to say. You can choose your media outlet, and so you're not confronted with opinions that disagree with yours. Well, that was really the model of American journalism in the 18th and 19th century. And there were newspapers that were attuned to particular, I mean, parties had their own newspapers, presidential administrations had their own newspapers. And so we're reverting to that time. Now, this may or may not be coincidental, but it was also a time of relatively, generally weak and comparatively insignificant presidents. The presidency achieved anything like its modern form only with the beginning of the 20th century. But through the 19th century, Congress was the dominant force in American politics, and everybody thought that's the way it should be. There were brief exceptions to this. They were, well, crises like the Civil War, and occasionally you'd get a force of nature like Andrew Jackson. But until the 20th century, the president was not the center of American politics. And in terms of the role of personality, personality matters tremendously. But the personality that worked for Andrew Jackson didn't work for Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln's personality would not have worked in the days of Theodore Roosevelt. And Franklin Roosevelt's personality would not work today, and Lyndon Johnson's wouldn't work either. The personality has to match the time. And with Lyndon Johnson, if you've been to the Johnson Library, various other places where you can see mock-ups of LBJ's Oval Office. And the thing that gets the attention of the school kids who go through is the television set with the 3 screens. And Johnson was considered such a voracious consumer of the media, he would watch all 3 of the evening news shows at the same time. Well, imagine a president today trying to keep track of all the media outlets. It would be quite impossible.
You have a lot of eyes.
Well, yeah. And so a president today faces a different kind of challenge. One of Franklin Roosevelt's secrets of success was his mastery of the principal medium of the day, radio. And Roosevelt's fireside chats became legendary as Roosevelt's way of getting around the largely Republican newspaper press of the day and speaking directly to individuals. And Ronald Reagan, JFK a little bit, Ronald Reagan even more, was the master of the medium of his day, television. Now, I don't know if the media, and it's a very, very plural today, can have a master. It definitely is the case that it's a lot harder for a president to get the message out. But I will just add one thing at this point on Obama. George is absolutely right that the American economy is in the worst shape that it has been in since the Great Depression. Having said that, Barack Obama just might get reelected. And the fact that he just might get reelected is an astonishing statement given the context of the economy. When the economy is doing as badly as it is today, presidents don't get reelected. Historically, there should be an uprising within the Democratic Party. He should be having to fight off challengers simply for the nomination. He's not. And if I were making book today, I'd say Obama's going to win next year, in part because the Republicans can't figure out who they are, and they've gotten themselves in a situation where the only type of candidate they are able to nominate, and here I will share, this isn't simply because I live in Texas, and I'm hoping that my governor is going to go on to different things, but I think Rick Perry's going to get the Republican nomination. And we could talk about why, but he also can't beat Obama. And this is typical of where the Republicans are. They are so split and they're so hostage to their right wing that the only person who can get the nomination is somebody who can't win the general election. And I think that's where we will see Obama's strength in reaching out to that broader public and not just the fractionalized publics.
He's going to win by default.
Well, that was going to be my next question, is what right now, both in terms of governance and in terms of re-election, what's the biggest challenge that President Obama faces? Is it the economy? Is it the Tea Party? Is it the Republican Party? Is it a divided Congress? What do you think is the biggest thing he has to get over? Any of you?
Well, you never know what they're really, because you don't know what the internal polls are showing. That's one of the things that so strikes me. I started about learning about Lyndon Johnson is you read the newspapers on what's happening in a certain month, and then you go to the minutes of the meetings in the White House and the internal communications, and it's like what's in the newspapers and magazines. I say it's like the shadow to the substance. This is what they're really thinking, and I don't think, but I'll just say one thing that it seems to me, there are only 4 or 5 states that are really in play in this election. And they seem to me, Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, they all seem to me to be states where unemployment is the
Rust Belt
great,
states,
is the
basically.
great, is the, yes, the Rust Belt state.
And Florida, where unemployment's
Florida.
also very bad. Yeah.
That's the one I left out.
Right.
Right? And so I think that if you're trying to get reelected, and if, in fact, this is what the polls are showing him, his internal polls are showing him, he has a tremendous problem in being reelected, even by default.
Because of those 5 states.
Because of those states.
Right.
Yeah.
Bill, what do you think the biggest thing he faces right now?
Well, I'm actually an optimist. If I were in Obama's camp, I would be an optimist, and I'll start with the current debt ceiling negotiations. I think things have shifted in a way that he wins almost no matter how it turns out. If they get a deal, whether it's the big deal, the medium deal, or a smaller deal, he can say, we got this deal.
I did it.
Yeah. If they don't, he has shifted the onus, so it's really, he's the one who's sounding very reasonable. And the Republicans are sounding increasingly shrill. And he can, run against Eric Cantor and the ones who are going to vote against anything, any kind of debt ceiling raising, and he'll come across looking like the reasonable person. Now, one of the real wild cards in this is foreign policy. And a lot of really bad things could have happened so far during Obama's first term that didn't. And foreign policy has gone reasonably well. Now, there's still lots of really bad things that could happen between now and a year from November. And if any of that happens, then he's stuck dealing with that.
Too many wild cards at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
How about you, George? What do you think he's facing?
I think it's just the profound sense of discontent in the country, which has been with us, since 2008, and he didn't break through it. In 2009, he arrived with all the wind at his back, with not an overwhelming majority a la Roosevelt and Johnson, but really big majorities in Congress, with a big majority in the popular vote, unlike anything we've seen, since Ronald Reagan, actually, or George H.W. Bush in '88. And we could do a counterfactual as to the things that he might have done in a different order, in a different way, that might have produced different results in terms of popular support. But he has been fighting a headwind from the very beginning, starting with the fact that the Republicans shamelessly, having largely created this mess, refused to do a thing to help him to clean it up. And in fact, basically made the calculation that if they don't help him out, the country will decide that it's his burden, and when things don't get better, as they may have gambled they wouldn't, it will be his fault.
Well,
I think that was the very cynical decision made by the Republican Party from even before the inauguration. He lost the ground he came in with, the ground where the country really had invested their hopes in him.
Lost it because he lost it, or because circumstances lost it for him?
I remember those early weeks of like February, March, April 2009. A whole lot of things happened that, looking back, seemed like critical things that at the time I wasn't even paying much attention to, because it seemed like we were on a much longer time horizon. No, in American politics today, 1 week can make a gigantic difference. For example, the AIG bonuses came out in, I think, March of '09. And there was a tremendous national uproar. It was the first time the anger over the financial crisis really found a target. And instead of harnessing it, finding a way to say, I'm just as angry as you, and we're going to do something about it, because the people who brought the country to its knees should not be profiting off taxpayer bailout money. Instead, basically, Geithner went into Obama and said, there's nothing we can do about it. These are contracts. Summers said, Larry Summers said, yeah, these are contracts. The House was all up in arms, and there were some demagogic bills about 99% taxation of the bonus money, which probably would have been unconstitutional. In his high-minded way, Obama decided, I'd rather do the unpopular but right thing and not touch those bonuses and not say anything and not be a demagogue about it. And he lost some of the public's confidence at that moment. And there are other things that happened around the same time. The stimulus bill, they never explained to the country what it would do. and how how it was going to work.
So it was their own.
And so I think from the very start,
They made
he
some
was so
mistakes.
consumed with all the things coming at him, just more things than any human being could possibly deal with, that he began to lose his hold on the public from the first days.
Could I just get a clarification here? When you say, I don't mean this as a joke, when you say high-minded, do you mean that as a criticism?
No, it's great to have a man who can think and articulate and is honest and for whom the English language is a friend and not an enemy, and who can write a speech accepting the Nobel Peace Prize that invokes, without naming him, Reinhold Niebuhr, and who can who can write a speech about race that invokes, without naming him, James Baldwin. I mean, this is a miracle that we have a president like this. It's a great thing, but it's not the only thing he needs. I was just rereading this essay by Max Weber on politics as a vocation, and there's two kinds of politician in it. One who practices the ethic of responsibility, and one who practices the ethic of ultimate ends. Obama practices the ethic of responsibility. That word is the key word of his presidency. And it becomes a kind of an end in itself, to be responsible. The Republicans practice the ethic of ultimate ends. We don't care what the consequences are. We're going to go with our convictions. Obama has one but not the other. The Republicans have one but not the other. Neither can present the full personality of a leader.
A community bank grows with its neighborhoods. Bridgehampton National Bank has embraced the needs of local businesses throughout Suffolk County, Long Island.
Bridgehampton National Bank has been one of the most important partners that Guildhall has had, and they are helping us with the funding of this wonderful renovation. We actually couldn't do it without Bridgehampton National Bank.
Bridgehampton National Bank, many success stories, one bank.
This broadcast of the Hamptons Institute at Guildhall is being brought to you by Bridgehampton National Bank.
I just want to do some version of a lightning round here, which is, very quickly, what's the single best accomplishment of this administration so far? Very quick, one thing.
To focus the debate of the country on long-term issues like the deficit.
Passing a health care bill. 40 million people who didn't have insurance before have it now. That's quite an accomplishment.
George?
Yeah, I'd say the same, the health care bill.
Okay. Let's go to some of your questions, and we will, of course, come back
Bill
here.
was wrong when he said that the severity of the economic crisis wasn't severe enough to make a difference. When Obama came in, there were actually 3 economic crises at the same time. The first was the middle class was disappearing, indicative of your national debt to GDP ratio, which was half of GDP in 1980, and now is 5 times of GDP. It's $75 trillion. It's an impossible number to look at. The other thing is that from 2001, the private sector stopped creating jobs. So you have no way to create jobs, you have no demand, and in using Summers and Geithner, he paid no attention to these 2 things. And I wonder why he ignored these 2 issues. Maybe he just didn't know what to do about it.
Thank you for your question. George, you want to?
No, I couldn't agree more. I think Obama does care about those issues. He talked about them constantly during the campaign. He may not know what to do about them. I think that with the stimulus, they got what they thought they could get. Maybe they didn't push hard enough to try for more and a different, a different kind of proportion of spending to tax cuts. It was too weak given both the short-term gale force wind of the financial crisis and the long-term erosion that you're talking about. I don't know that politicians know how to solve these problems any longer. Biden runs this thing called the Middle Class Task Force, which is all about restoring the middle class. We never hear about it. No one really knows what they're doing. It's as if they kind of have given up the idea that they're actually going to persuade the public that they can solve these big problems. And you're right, the people he picked not only, as we all know, were some of the purveyors of policies that led to the financial crisis, but also were the type who, when it came to things like AIG bonuses, advised the president to ignore the public, to do the high-minded thing. And in that case, I think the wrong thing. So his advisors don't have a feel for the pulse of the country. And I think inevitably a president becomes isolated in the White House. We don't hear from Obama for long periods of time. This is not on the economy, but on Afghanistan. Throughout 2009, he gave one speech on the war while he was in very serious meetings planning an escalation. He's great at those meetings. For some reason, he fades out in the public's imagination. It's a weird thing, given what a gigantic figure he was in our imagination throughout 2008.
That he's come to this.
Could I just add something
Go ahead,
here?
Bill,
And
then
this-
we'll go to another
This relates to
question.
something George said earlier and your question about the role of personality. One of the striking things to me about President Obama is his inability to get effectively mad in public. And he is the great conciliator. He's the one who wants to bring people together. But if you look at American history, the biggest steps forward, or you could call it backward, the biggest steps occur when a president, typically the president, separates the sheep from the goats. When he singles out those bad people and is able to isolate them and reduce their numbers so that they can't resist. Both Roosevelts were brilliant at this. The first Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, talked about the malefactors of great wealth. And Franklin Roosevelt railed against the economic royalists. Because, politics is an emotional game. And unless you can engage people's emotions, you can't lead a movement. You can't get people to do what they wouldn't do on their own. Obama is he's a very cool personality. And I don't know, at least I don't think on the basis of evidence I've seen, that he's the kind of guy who can get mad.